The sun, a relentless, white-hot coin in the vast, bleached expanse of the sky, poured its heat upon the world below. It baked the cracked dry earth of the remote road, raising shimmering waves of distortion from the asphalt that snaked its way through the scrubland and dust. This was a place forgotten by most, a mere line on a map connecting 2 points of significance to no one but the military that owned the vast training grounds to the north and the small, stubborn town to the south. At a small, makeshift checkpoint, little more than a striped wooden barricade, a faded windsock, and a dusty patrol vehicle, time itself seemed to have melted and pooled, moving with the sluggish, syrupy pace of the flies buzzing around an empty water bottle. Inside the air-conditioned cabin of the patrol vehicle, the hum of the engine was a constant, low drone, a sound so familiar it had become a part of the silence. Officer Ben Carter, his uniform shirt crisp despite the hour, drummed his fingers on the steering wheel in a rhythm of profound boredom. His eyes, shielded by mirrored aviator sunglasses, scanned the empty road for the 100th time that hour, seeing nothing but the same heat-hazed nothingness. He was a man built on procedure, on the clear, straight lines of rules and regulations, and this assignment was an affront to all of that. It was a pointless duty, a placeholder for real police work. His partner, Officer Maria Rodriguez, leaned against the passenger window, her head resting on the glass. She watched the landscape, her eyes tracing the flight of a lone hawk circling high above on some unseen thermal. She was the counterpoint to Ben's restless energy, her stillness a practiced patience. Where Ben saw emptiness, Maria saw the subtle details, the way the scrub grass bent in the faint breeze, the distant glint of a communications tower on the horizon, the complete and utter absence of life. It was peaceful in its own stark way, but even peace could curdle into monotony. Another thrilling day protecting the Republic from tumbleweeds, Ben said, his voice cutting through the hum of the air conditioner. He sighed, a long, exaggerated sound of suffering. I swear, Rodriguez, if I have to fill out one more log entry that says, no activity, I might just lose my mind. Maria didn't turn her head. Could be worse. Could be raining. Could be a bus full of rowdy tourists. Enjoy the quiet, Ben. It'll be gone soon enough. Quiet? This isn't quiet. This is a coma. Ben adjusted his sunglasses, his gaze drifting to a notice pinned to the sun visor. It was a memo, slightly crumpled, about an upcoming high-level military exercise. You know what's happening tomorrow? The big one. Operation something or other. The whole northern sector is going to be crawling with army. Tanks, helicopters, the works. I read the memo, Maria said, a small smile playing on her lips. You've only mentioned it 6 times today. Because it's interesting. Ben insisted, turning in his seat to face her, suddenly animated by the topic. General Sharma herself is supposed to be leading it. Can you believe that? The Iron Butterfly. The youngest person to ever make general in the history of the country. A living legend is going to be a few miles from this very spot, and we're stuck out here on babysitting duty. He spoke the name with a kind of reverent awe, painting a picture in the air with his hands. I bet she's something else. Probably looks like hewn granite. Voice that can command 1,000 men with a whisper. Medals on his chest that tell 100 stories of battles we'll never know. In Ben's mind, General Sharma was a figure of immense, almost mythical stature. An older, stern-faced man with a spine of steel and eyes that had seen the hard truth of combat. A figure of absolute, unquestionable authority. Maria finally turned from the window, her dark eyes thoughtful. Or, she could just be a person, Ben. A very smart, very capable person who happens to have a lot of responsibility. You've built her up into a superhero in your head. That's because she is. Ben argued, his pride in the military's hierarchy evident. That's the point of rank. You look at a general, you should see authority. You should see power. It commands respect. Not like this. He gestured vaguely out the windshield at the barren road. This, nothing. This is where respect goes to die. He slumped back in his seat, the brief flare of excitement extinguished by the oppressive heat and inertia of their post. The landscape remained unchanged, a painting of dust and despair. The hawk continued its silent, patient circles. The flies resumed their lazy buzzing. The 2 officers settled back into their respective silences, one fuming at the injustice of his mundane assignment, the other accepting the slow, heavy passage of time in the immense, silent oven of the day, both completely unaware that the quiet they were discussing was indeed about to be shattered, not by tanks or helicopters, but by a single, solitary figure now walking towards them from the northern stretch of the empty road. The silence of the checkpoint, once a heavy blanket of boredom, was first pierced not by a sound, but by a subtle shift in the light. A figure resolved itself from the shimmering heat waves that danced on the northern stretch of asphalt, a lone silhouette moving with a steady, purposeful rhythm against the backdrop of bleached scrubland. The intense sun, positioned directly overhead, erased details, casting the approaching person as little more than a human-shaped cutout against the glare. Ben, whose vigilant watch had long since devolved into a glassy-eyed stare, was the first to notice the movement. He sat up straighter, a flicker of interest, the first genuine one in hours, cutting through his lethargy. Well. Look what the heat dragged in, he muttered, his voice a low grumble that pulled Maria's attention from her window. Maria squinted, shielding her eyes with her hand. The figure was on foot, which was immediately unusual. This was not a road for walking. The nearest town was a solid 15-mile trek south, and the northern perimeter was nothing but the vast, restricted military training grounds, sealed off by fences and warning signs for another 10 miles. There were no broken-down vehicles visible on the road behind the figure, no indication of where they might have come from. It was as if the desert itself had conjured a solitary wanderer. As the figure drew closer, details began to emerge, slowly and unsatisfyingly. It was a woman, her stride long and economical, devoid of any urgency or hesitation. She wore a standard-issue military fatigue uniform, the kind seen on 1,000 soldiers, but hers was faded from countless washes and dusted with a fine pale powder from the road, blending her into the landscape like a ghost. The uniform was practical, devoid of any unit patches, name tags, or most notably, any visible rank insignia. It was the bland, unmarked kit of someone who intended to be anonymous, or perhaps someone for whom labels were irrelevant. Ben's initial flicker of interest began to curdle into something else, suspicion mixed with a healthy dose of professional annoyance. His world was one of clear identifiers: badges, licenses, permits. This person was a blank slate, an irregularity in his otherwise orderly, if dull, domain. No vehicle. No cover. Out here in this oven, he mused aloud, more to himself than to Maria. Deserter, maybe? Or some environmental protester trying to get a peek at the war games. Doesn't look right. Maria observed more neutrally. The woman wasn't wandering, her path was direct, her gaze fixed ahead, ignoring the oppressive heat with a practiced indifference. She carried herself not with the lost air of a deserter, but with the focused bearing of someone with a specific destination in mind. There was an unnerving stillness to her expression, even at a distance, a calm that seemed at odds with the harsh environment. She looks like she knows where she's going, Maria offered, her tone cautious. Maybe she's with the base. Logistics or something. Got lost on a detail. Without a vehicle? Without anyone knowing she's out here? Doubt it, Ben scoffed, his pride prickling slightly at the suggestion that this dusty, anonymous figure could be part of the prestigious machine he'd been admiring moments before. They have procedures for that. They don't just let their people wander the desert alone. He opened his door, the rush of blistering air a tangible shock against the conditioned cabin. He stepped out, adjusting his duty belt, his posture automatically shifting into one of official authority. He positioned himself squarely in front of the barricade, a clear human stop sign. The woman did not alter her pace as she closed the final 100 yards. Her face became clearer. She was younger than either officer expected, perhaps in her early 30s, with sharp, intelligent features that were presently set in a neutral mask. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple, severe braid, functional and unbecoming. Sweat beaded on her forehead and traced a path through the dust on her temples, but she made no move to wipe it away. Her eyes, a cool, focused shade of brown, briefly scanned the entire checkpoint, the car, the barricade, Maria still in the passenger seat, before coming to rest on Ben. There was no apprehension in her look, no curiosity, only a swift, analytical assessment that was somehow more disconcerting than open hostility. Ben cleared his throat, ready to launch into his standard spiel. "Ma'am," he began, his voice assuming the practiced, slightly amplified tone he used for official interactions. "This is a restricted access checkpoint. Can I ask what your business is on this road today?" He expected hesitation, a fumbled explanation, perhaps even fear. The woman stopped a few feet from him. She did not smile. "I am conducting a survey," she said. Her voice was level, calm, and devoid of any discernible accent. It was a voice that stated facts, nothing more. Ben blinked. A survey. Out here. It was so absurd it almost bypassed his suspicion. "A survey," he repeated flatly. "What kind of survey requires you to be walking alone on a restricted access road in the middle of a designated military exercise zone?" He emphasized the words, waiting for the lie to unravel. The woman's eyes held his. "A final perimeter survey," she replied as if that explained everything. Her gaze then flicked over his shoulder toward the vast emptiness of the training grounds beyond the checkpoint, and for a fraction of a second, her focus was entirely elsewhere, as if she were mentally cataloging the landscape, measuring it against some internal checklist. This dismissal, this sheer lack of engagement with his authority, irked Ben profoundly. She wasn't being evasive, she was being efficient, and he was an impediment to that efficiency. The seeds of a confrontation, tiny and hot as the surrounding sand, were sown in that moment, nurtured by the sun, the silence, and Ben's own injured pride. The woman's answer, delivered with such flat, unadorned certainty, seemed to hang in the superheated air between them, a statement that refused to be questioned. A final perimeter survey. To Ben Carter, whose entire professional existence was built upon the foundation of questions, forms, and verifiable answers, it was not merely insufficient, it was an insult. It was the kind of vague, brush-off answer a teenager might give a concerned parent. The heat, his boredom, and now this blatant disregard for proper procedure began a slow simmer within him. This dusty, anonymous woman was treating him like a minor inconvenience, a piece of the scenery to be navigated around, and for a man who took immense pride in the authority of his uniform, that was an unpardonable sin. He took a half-step closer, intentionally invading her personal space, a tactic he used to establish dominance. The mirrored lenses of his sunglasses reflected her own dusty, impassive face back at her. "A survey," he said again, drawing the word out, layering it with thick, unmistakable skepticism. "You'll understand if I need a little more than that, ma'am. This is a secure area. We've got live-fire exercises scheduled. I'm going to need to see some identification. Proper identification." He stressed the word proper, his tone making it clear he expected her to have none, that this would be the moment her flimsy story collapsed. The woman's eyes, those cool, assessing eyes, did not waver from his. They didn't flicker with nervousness at his proximity, nor did they flare with anger at his tone. They simply watched him, and in their depths, Ben thought he saw something else, something far more dangerous than anger, a flicker of profound impatience. It was the look a master craftsman might give a child fumbling with their tools. She hesitated for a beat, a silent calculation happening behind her gaze. Her right hand twitched as if to move toward a pocket, but then stilled. "My authorization extends beyond your need to see a card, officer," she stated, her voice still level, but now carrying a new, harder edge. "The security of this perimeter is my direct responsibility. Now, if you'll excuse me, this barricade is in the wrong position. It needs to be moved back precisely 10 meters. There's a blind crest 50 yards north that it doesn't cover." The words landed on Ben not as a request or a suggestion, but as an order. An order delivered to him on his checkpoint, by this person who looked like she'd just crawled out of a ditch. It was so audacious, so utterly preposterous, that a stunned laugh escaped him, a short, harsh bark that was swallowed by the vast emptiness. "Move the barricade?" he repeated, his voice rising in pitch. "Lady, I don't know who you think you are, but you're in no position to be giving orders. You're on foot, in a restricted zone with no ID and a story that doesn't hold water. My barricade is exactly where it's supposed to be." His own pride was now fully engaged, a brittle shield against her unnerving calm. She wasn't just a nuisance, she was a challenge to his competence, to his very command of this small slice of the world. Maria, who had been watching the exchange from the passenger seat with growing unease, now opened her door and stepped out. The wave of heat was immense. "Ben," she said, her voice low and cautious, a clear attempt to pour water on the building fire. "Maybe we should just call it in. Let the base MP sort it out. It's their jurisdiction anyway." She could feel the wrongness of the situation, a tension that went beyond a simple rule breaker. This woman's confidence was not bluster, it was absolute, and that was terrifying. Ben didn't even look at her. His entire focus was on the woman, a dangerous tunnel vision narrowing his perspective. The woman, in turn, finally broke her gaze from Ben to look at Maria. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if acknowledging the voice of reason. Then her eyes returned to Ben. "Your partner is correct. A call to the base would resolve this unnecessary delay." She said unnecessary delay, as if it were a synonym for foolishness. That was the final straw. To Ben, her agreement with Maria felt like collusion, a tactic to undermine him. The suggestion to call the base wasn't a solution, it was an admission that she knew she wouldn't pass his inspection, that she needed a higher authority to bail her out. His mind, feverish with indignation, connected the dots in the worst possible way. No ID, vague story, knowledge of military procedures trying to bypass local authority. A call to the base is exactly what's going to happen, he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. But not for you. For me. To report a possible security breach. Maybe even a deserter. Or a spy. He let the words hang, the accusations ugly and loud in the quiet desert. The woman's expression did not change. But the air around her seemed to grow colder. The patience in her eyes vanished, replaced by something flat and final. A spy, she repeated, her voice so quiet it was almost a whisper, yet it carried with the cutting force of a scalpel. You are choosing to be an obstacle. She shook her head, a minute movement of disappointment that was infinitely more humiliating than any shout. This is a waste of my time and a failure of your duty. Now step aside. The command was absolute. It was the voice of genuine authority, the kind that brooks no argument. And it broke something in Ben Carter. Reason fled. Procedure evaporated. All that was left was a raw, screaming need to prove that he was in charge, that he could not be spoken to this way on his own road. The heat, the boredom, the humiliation. It all coalesced into one catastrophic, impulsive decision. His face set into a hard, rigid mask. No, he said, the words simple and stupid. You're not going anywhere. You're under detention for obstructing an officer and trespassing on a restricted military zone. And before Maria could even process the words, before she could shout a warning, Ben moved. In one swift, brutal motion, he grabbed the woman's arm, spun her around, and pushed her toward the spindly, shadeless tree that stood a few feet from the road. He pulled a set of handcuffs from his belt. The metal gleamed, wicked and bright, in the harsh sunlight. The world seemed to hold its breath. The act was so sudden, so violently out of place in the stagnant afternoon, that for a moment even the buzzing of the flies ceased. The woman, General Anya Sharma, did not fight him. There was no struggle, no cry of outrage, no physical resistance whatsoever. Her body went rigid, not with fear, but with a controlled, seething stillness that was far more unnerving than any thrashing could have been. She allowed herself to be maneuvered the few steps to the scrawny, sun-bleached tree, her boots scuffing lightly in the dust. Ben's hands were rough, his actions fueled by a toxic mix of wounded pride and performative authority. He was making a point, and the point required a spectacle. The cold, hard steel of the handcuffs encircled one of her wrists, and he pulled her arms behind the narrow trunk of the tree, snapping the other cuff closed with a definitive, metallic click that echoed in the profound silence. The sound seemed to break a spell. Maria Rodriguez finally found her voice, a strangled cry of disbelief. Ben, what are you doing? Have you lost your mind? Uncuff her right now. She took a step forward, her face pale beneath the heat, her hand outstretched as if she could physically pull the terrible decision back from the brink. This wasn't procedure, this was madness. This was the kind of reckless, ego-driven action that ended careers and spawned lawsuits. Ben ignored her completely. He was committed now, riding a wave of adrenaline and self-righteous fury. He stepped back from the tree, his chest heaving slightly, though the physical effort had been minimal. He looked at his handiwork, the woman in dusty fatigues, secured to the pathetic tree, her back to him. It was a pitiful and deeply degrading image, a deliberate act of humiliation designed to shatter her composure and reinforce his dominance. He expected tears now. He expected begging. He expected the arrogant facade to crumble into desperate apologies. He walked around the tree to face her. The woman had not moved. Her head was held high, her spine straight. She was not slumped against the trunk in defeat. She was standing at a sort of grim, uncomfortable attention. Her eyes were open, and they were not looking at the ground in shame. They were fixed on the northern horizon, her gaze focused on some distant point beyond the hills, as if she were looking straight through him, through the checkpoint, through the entire embarrassing situation. Her expression was not one of anger or fear, but of a cold, terrifying calm. It was the face of someone who was already calculating the consequences, not for herself but for him. Ben's bravado faltered for a second under that gaze. Her silence was louder than any scream. To fill the void, to justify himself, he spoke, his voice louder than necessary, trying to recapture the authority that was already beginning to feel cheap and hollow. You can stay right there and cool off, he declared, jabbing a finger in her direction. You can think about what happens when you don't respect the law. When a real superior officer gets here, maybe you'll have a better attitude. Finally, the woman's eyes shifted from the horizon. They moved slowly, deliberately to lock onto his. The intensity in them was so sharp it felt like a physical pressure. When she spoke, her voice was low, measured, and carried a weight of absolute certainty that froze the blood in his veins. It was not the plea of a desperate prisoner, it was the pronouncement of a judge. "You have made a catastrophic error in judgment, officer," she said, each word precise and cold, dropping into the silence like stones into a deep well. "You are acting on pride, not protocol. You will regret this action. You will regret it very soon." The promise in her words was not a threat of violence, but something far worse, a promise of inevitability. Ben felt a cold knot of doubt form in his stomach, but he crushed it down, smothering it with bluster. He forced a laugh, a dry, brittle sound. "Is that right? Well, I'm trembling. Save your dramatic speeches for someone who's impressed." He turned his back on her, a final act of dismissal, and strode back toward the patrol car, leaving Maria standing horrified between the vehicle and the tree, her eyes wide with the dawning realization that her partner had just tied a knot there was no untying. The general did not watch him go. Her gaze had already returned to the northern horizon, waiting with an unnerving patience for the inevitable truth to come rolling over the hills. The humiliation was not hers, it was his, and it was only just beginning. For a long, stretched moment after Ben's retreat, the world returned to its previous state of suspended animation. The only sounds were the faint, hot whisper of the wind moving across the dust and the ragged, too-loud rhythm of Ben's own breathing as he tried to steady himself against the hood of the patrol car. He refused to look back at the tree, focusing instead on the empty southern road, as if willing a superior officer to appear from that direction and validate his actions. Maria stood frozen, her body angled halfway between the car and the tree, a statue of conflict and dread. The figure by the tree remained motionless, a silent, accusing monument to his impulsivity. The scene was a tableau of profound tension, a bomb that had failed to detonate, leaving everyone waiting for the blast. It was Maria who heard it first. Her head, which had been bowed in frustrated thought, snapped up. Her eyes, wide and searching, scanned the empty northern horizon. It wasn't a sound yet, not truly. It was a vibration, a subliminal hum that was felt more than heard, a disturbance in the very air itself. It was the faintest possible tremor through the soles of their boots, a sensation so subtle that it could have been mistaken for a trick of the heat or a passing heavy truck on a highway miles away. But there were no highways here. Maria's hand went to the hood of the car, her fingers splaying flat against the warm metal. "Ben," she said, her voice low and tight with a new, different fear. "Do you feel that?" Ben, still wrapped in the angry thrum of his own heartbeat, shook his head irritably. "Feel what? It's nothing. Just the wind." But even as he said it, he fell silent. He could feel it now too. A low, pervasive thrumming that was seeping up from the ground, a sensation that was gathering strength with every passing second. The flies, which had been lazily circling, suddenly vanished. The air grew still and heavy, as if the desert itself were holding its breath in anticipation. Then the sound began. It started as a deep, basso rumble, so low it was almost inaudible, more a pressure in the chest than a noise in the ears. It was the sound of distant thunder, but the sky was a clear, pitiless blue devoid of any cloud. The rumble intensified, layering upon itself, growing from a suggestion into a definite, rolling roar. It was no longer a single sound but a symphony of power, the grinding shriek of metal tracks on rock, the deep-throated growl of immense diesel engines pushed to their limit, the harmonic whine of heavy machinery moving in concert. It was the sound of raw, industrial power, and it was growing closer, swelling, advancing from the north with terrifying speed. Ben finally turned from the southern road, his bravado evaporating as the sound washed over him. His face, previously flushed with anger, began to drain of color. The mirrored sunglasses hid his eyes, but his mouth fell slightly open, his jaw gone slack. He took an involuntary step back, his hand reaching behind him to find the solidity of the car door. This was not the sound of a single jeep or a truck carrying a few military police. This was the sound of an army. A very large, very mobile, and very angry army. Maria backed up until she was pressed against the side of the patrol car, her hand over her mouth, her eyes fixed on the northern horizon where the heat haze was now beginning to distort in a new, violent way. The shimmering air seemed to coalesce, to solidify into shapes. First, a cloud of dust, a rolling brown fog that blotted out the horizon. Then, emerging from the dust like leviathans from a deep sea, came the outlines of vehicles. The angular, predatory forms of main battle tanks, their long gun barrels leveled forward like accusing fingers. The hulking shapes of armored personnel carriers, their tracks churning the earth. The silhouettes of support vehicles and command trucks. And surrounding this steel tide, visible as a dark fringe ahead of the dust cloud, were figures. Hundreds of them. Soldiers, moving at a rapid pace, their advance a coordinated, unstoppable wave of green and brown that was sweeping directly toward the tiny, insignificant checkpoint. The roar was deafening now, a physical force that vibrated in their teeth and shook the ground beneath their feet. The entire northern world had been replaced by the approaching might of the army, and it was heading straight for them. Ben's smug certainty, his arrogant pride, everything he had been moments before, was utterly obliterated by the overwhelming, earth-shaking reality of what he had done. The world dissolved into a controlled, roaring chaos. The lead tanks, monstrous behemoths of painted green steel, did not slow their advance. They rolled forward with a terrifying, inexorable momentum, their tracks chewing up the barren earth on either side of the asphalt, effortlessly bypassing the flimsy wooden barricade as if it were a twig. They did not stop. They simply flowed around the checkpoint, their movements perfectly synchronized, forming a wide, encircling half-circle that cut off any view of the northern horizon, replacing it with a wall of armored vehicles and grim-faced soldiers. The dust cloud they had kicked up rolled over the scene like a tidal wave, a thick, gritty fog that coated everything. The patrol car, the barricade, Ben and Maria's faces, in a layer of fine, choking powder. The noise was all-consuming, a deafening orchestra of roaring engines, shrieking metal, and the thunderous clank of treads. From the heart of this mechanical storm, a single armored personnel carrier, its hull bristling with antennae denoting a command vehicle, ground to a halt directly in front of the checkpoint. The rear hatch slammed down before the dust had even settled. And from within a man emerged. He was not a large man, but he moved with a contained, explosive energy that commanded the space around him. His uniform was crisp, adorned with the eagle and stars of a full colonel. His face was a mask of cold, focused fury, his eyes scanning the scene with a tactical precision that missed nothing. The two stunned police officers, the pathetic checkpoint, and finally, his gaze landing on the tree. On the woman tied to it. The expression on Colonel David Chen's face did not change, but something in his posture tightened, coiling like a spring. He did not run. He strode, a quick, powerful march that ate up the distance between his vehicle and the tree, his boots kicking up puffs of dust. The soldiers who had dismounted from the other vehicles fell into a rigid, silent formation behind him, their rifles held at port arms, their eyes fixed forward, but the air around them crackled with a shared, incandescent rage. The encircling maneuver was complete. Ben and Maria were trapped in the center of a tightening ring of steel and righteous anger. Ben stood utterly paralyzed. The sunglasses hid the sheer, unadulterated terror in his eyes, but it was evident in the way his hands trembled at his sides, in the way he seemed to have forgotten how to breathe. The scale of his mistake was no longer an abstract concept. It was a physical reality that surrounded him, deafened him, and smelled of diesel and dust. He was a pebble that had inadvertently triggered an avalanche, and the avalanche was now looking right at him. Colonel Chin reached the tree. He did not look at Ben. His entire world had narrowed to the woman secured to the trunk. He came to a snapping, perfect halt and threw up a salute so sharp it could have cut glass. His voice, when he spoke, was not a yell, but it carried over the din of idling engines with the force of a cannon shot, clear, formal, and laced with a horror he could barely contain. General Sharma. We assembled and advanced on your coordinates as ordered, ma'am. The words, General Sharma, hit Ben Carter with the physical force of a blow. They sucked the air from his lungs and the strength from his legs. He felt a wave of nausea so powerful he had to grab the hood of the car to keep from falling. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The dusty woman. The impatient orders. The calm defiance. It hadn't been arrogance. It had been authority. The genuine, unimpeachable authority of the Iron Butterfly herself, the living legend he had been fantasizing about just minutes before. And he had handcuffed her to a tree. He had accused the general of the entire national army of being a spy. The humiliation was total, absolute, and crushing. It was a vertigo of shame so profound he wished the earth would open up and swallow him whole. The encircling soldiers, their faces like stone, were not just an army. They were an audience to the most spectacular professional suicide imaginable. The silence that followed Chen's words, in the momentary lull between engine revs, was the most deafening sound Ben had ever heard. The silence that followed Colonel Chen's pronouncement was not truly silent. It was filled with the ticking of cooling metal from the idling tanks, the low growl of their engines, and the faint dry rasp of the wind stirring the settling dust. But these sounds only served to amplify the void where human speech should have been. For Ben Carter, That void was a chasm into which his career, his reputation, and every shred of his self-respect had just plummeted. The words General Sharma echoed in his skull, not as words but as a verdict, each syllable a hammer blow shattering the fragile edifice of his arrogance. The blood drained from his face so completely he felt lightheaded, his grip on the hot metal of the car hood the only thing anchoring him to a reality that had become a waking nightmare. He could feel the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him, the collective, unblinking gaze of the entire army, and each pair felt like a brand of contempt. Colonel Chen's salute remained held, rigid and unwavering, a testament to his discipline even in the face of the unbelievable. His eyes, fixed on General Sharma, were wide with a mixture of fury, confusion, and a deep, protective concern. This was not how a general was meant to be greeted. This was a desecration. Without another word and without waiting for a command, Chen moved. He stepped forward, his movements sharp and efficient. He produced a key from his own pocket, a universal handcuff key, standard issue for field officers. His hands, unlike Ben's had been, were precise and careful as he inserted the key into the cuffs. The metallic click of the lock releasing was a tiny, insignificant sound, yet it seemed to crack through the air like a gunshot. The moment the cuffs fell away, Chen caught them before they could hit the ground, as if disposing of an offending object. General Sharma's arms, finally free, lowered slowly to her sides. She did not rub her wrists, though the skin was marked with angry red lines from the metal. She did not stretch or show any outward sign of discomfort. The act of being freed was met with the same stoic composure as the act of being restrained. She accepted the return of her autonomy not as a relief, but as her natural due. Colonel Chen took a half step back, his body still tensed, his eyes darting from his general to the petrified police officer and back again, awaiting orders, awaiting any indication of what apocalyptic response was required. It was then that Ben witnessed the true depth of his error. He expected the general to round on him, to unleash the full, terrifying wrath of her office. He expected to be arrested, screamed at, perhaps even struck. He was braced for a storm of righteous fury. But it did not come. General Sharma simply turned. Slowly, deliberately, she turned her back on Colonel Chen, on the assembled might of her army, and faced Ben Carter. Her expression was not one of rage. It was something far more devastating, a profound, weary disappointment. It was the look a master teacher might give a promising student who has just failed the simplest of tests in the most spectacular way. Her calm was more powerful than any tantrum. It spoke of a confidence so absolute that his actions were beneath her anger. They were merely a subject for analysis, a problem to be solved. She took a single step toward him. Ben flinched, an involuntary, pathetic tremor that ran through his entire body. She stopped. Her eyes, those cool, analytical eyes that had seen through him from the beginning, scanned him from head to toe, taking in his trembling form, his ashen face, the way he clung to the car for support. She saw the shattered remains of his pride and she did not gloat. She merely observed. The humiliation for Ben was now complete and internal. It was no longer about being seen by the army, it was about being truly seen by her. She saw the small, foolish man behind the mirrored sunglasses and the badge, and her silent, disappointed gaze reflected that pathetic image back at him with merciless clarity. The world had narrowed to this single point: a dusty road, a terrified policeman, and a general whose quiet presence was a more crushing force than any tank. She had not yet spoken a word to him, and already he was utterly, completely defeated. The silence stretched, becoming a tangible thing, a weight pressing down on Ben Carter more forcefully than the gaze of the entire army. General Sharma's eyes remained on him, and in their depths, he saw no trace of the fury he knew he deserved. Instead, he saw a cool, dispassionate analysis, as if he were a flawed equation on a chalkboard. When she finally spoke, her voice was not the thunderous command that had echoed over the engines moments before. It was quiet, measured, and carried all the more power for its lack of volume. It was a voice meant for him alone, a surgical instrument probing the precise nature of his failure. "Officer Carter," she began, and the use of his name, spoken with such flat neutrality, felt like an indictment. "Explain to me the procedural justification for your actions." She did not gesture to the tree, to the cuffs now held by Colonel Chen. She simply stood there, waiting for an answer he did not have. "What specific clause in your operating manual authorizes the detention of a superior officer based on," she paused, her head tilting slightly, "a subjective assessment of their appearance?" The question hung in the air, simple, direct, and utterly unanswerable. Ben's mouth opened, but no sound emerged. His mind, a frantic jumble of panic and shame, scrabbled for a defense and found nothing but a hollow void. There was no justification. There was only ego. He tried to form words. You didn't have ID, you were suspicious, you were rude, but each potential excuse withered and died before it reached his lips, exposed as the pathetic, self-justifying tripe it was under her unwavering gaze. Seeing his speechlessness, General Sharma continued, her tone never rising, never wavering from that terrible, calm clarity. You spoke of respect earlier. You believed my appearance did not command it. You believe respect is owed to the uniform, to the rank. She took another small step closer and Ben felt himself shrink. You're wrong. Respect is earned by action, by judgment, by competence. The uniform is a symbol, but it is not the substance. You focused on the symbol and ignored the person within it. You saw a woman who did not meet your expectation of authority, and your pride could not tolerate it. She turned slightly, her gaze sweeping to take in the silent, encircling soldiers, the vehicles, the entire awesome manifestation of real power that her leadership represented. This, she said, her voice still quiet but now encompassing the army around them, is not authority. This is the result of it. This is the tool. True authority is the decision to use it wisely. Or, her eyes returned to him, pinning him in place, the decision not to. She was dismantling him, piece by piece, not with anger but with truth. You had a simple task, secure a checkpoint. Your duty was to assess a situation with clarity and professionalism. Instead you saw a challenge to your ego. You were so concerned with being respected that you forgot how to be respectful. You were so invested in the theater of authority that you failed to recognize the real thing standing right in front of you. She let the words settle, each one a stone added to the cairn of his shame. Your failure today was not a failure of procedure. It was a failure of character. You judged a book by its cover, Officer Carter, and in doing so, you revealed the poverty of your own pages. Ben could not bear it. The sunglasses hid the tears of shame that were now welling in his eyes, but they could not hide the tremor in his hands or the way his shoulders slumped in utter defeat. She had not yelled. She had not threatened. She had simply held up a mirror, and the reflection was that of a small, foolish, and deeply humiliated man. The lesson was far more effective than any punishment could ever be. The moral failure was his, and she had outlined its every contour with devastating precision. He had no defense. There was none. He stood there, naked in his error, before a general, an army, and his horrified partner, completely and utterly broken. The general's words, precise and surgical, had carved away every last pretense, every shred of self-justification, leaving only the raw, ugly truth exposed. Ben Carter stood in the center of that truth, and it was a desolate place. The weight of hundreds of silent, judging eyes from the encircling army was a physical pressure, but it was nothing compared to the internal collapse happening within him. The arrogance that had been his armor had been vaporized, leaving him defenseless against a wave of shame so profound it felt like a physical illness. His stomach churned. His knees felt weak and watery. He was a joke, a cautionary tale, and the entire military might of the nation was there to witness it. He became aware of a hot, stinging pressure behind his eyes. The world, viewed through the mirrored lenses of his sunglasses, blurred at the edges. He could not look at General Sharma anymore. His gaze dropped, fixing instead on the dust-caked toes of his own boots, on the fine beige powder that covered everything. He saw the faint, scuffed marks in the dirt where he had roughly pulled her towards the tree. Each mark was a testament to his stupidity. A low, choked sound escaped his lips, a half-sob that was strangled in his throat. He had never felt smaller, more foolish, or more utterly worthless in his entire life. This was not about losing his job anymore. This was about losing any sense of who he thought he was. With a hand that trembled violently, he reached up and slowly, painfully removed his sunglasses. The sunlight, now unfiltered, felt like an accusation. He blinked, his eyes red-rimmed and wet, unable to fully stop the tears of pure humiliation that now traced clean paths through the dust on his cheeks. He forced himself to look up, not at the general's face, but at a point somewhere near her shoulder. He could not bear to meet her eyes. When he spoke, his voice was a broken thing, raspy and thick with emotion, stripped of all its former bluster and authority. It was the voice of a boy who had just realized the terrible, irreversible consequences of a stupid mistake. "General," he began, the title catching in his throat. He had to stop, swallow hard, and try again. "General Sharma? I have no excuse." The admission was torn from him, a raw and painful truth. "There is no justification for what I did. None." He took a shaky breath, his whole body trembling. "You're right. It was my pride. It was all my pride. The words were tumbling out now, a desperate, sincere confession meant not to save himself, but simply to acknowledge the depth of his failing, to give voice to the crushing regret. I was bored and I felt unimportant. And when you didn't act the way I thought someone important should act, I got angry. I wanted to prove I was in charge. I wanted to punish you for not being what I expected. He shook his head, a gesture of utter self-loathing. I was so blind. I was an idiot. Arrogant, foolish idiot. He finally risked a glance at her face, his expression one of utter contrition. I'm so sorry. Not because of all this, he gestured weakly at the tanks and soldiers surrounding them, but because I failed. I failed in my duty. I failed to be a good officer. I failed to be a decent person. I disrespected you, and everything you stand for. His voice dropped to a whisper. The apology, it's worthless, I know. It doesn't change what I did. But it's all I have to offer. He fell silent, his head bowing again, his body seeming to fold in on itself under the weight of his remorse. He was not asking for forgiveness. He was not expecting leniency. He was simply stating a fact, admitting his guilt before the court of his own conscience, which had now become the harshest judge of all. He awaited his sentence, whatever it might be, with a numb acceptance. He had apologized not to avoid punishment, but because it was the only truthful thing left for him to do. The humiliation was complete, but it had finally, painfully, given way to a raw and genuine humility. General Sharma listened to Ben's broken apology without interruption, her expression remaining an unreadable mask of calm assessment. She heard the crack in his voice, saw the genuine tremor of regret in his hands, and witnessed the complete dissolution of the arrogant facade he had presented such a short time ago. When he finished, hanging his head in a posture of utter defeat, the silence returned, but it was a different silence now. The tension of impending retribution had eased, replaced by the heavy, contemplative quiet of a lesson learned. Colonel Chen, standing rigidly a few paces away, watched the general, his own fury banked but ready to flare at her slightest command. He expected demotions, arrests, career-ending repercussions. The army around them expected justice, a show of force to avenge the insult to their commander. General Sharma's eyes moved from the top of Ben's bowed head to Maria, who stood pale and silent, a witness to her partner's downfall. She saw the fear in Maria's eyes, not for herself, but for the terrible fate about to befall Ben. The general's gaze then swept slowly across the faces of her soldiers, taking in their expectant, hardened expressions. Finally, her eyes returned to Ben. When she spoke, her voice was still quiet, but it now carried a different timbre, not the cutting edge of analysis but the measured tone of verdict. Officer Carter, she began, and he flinched at the sound of his name. A failure of character is not irredeemable. It is, however, a debt. And a debt must be paid. She paused, letting the words settle. You will not be arrested. You will not be charged with a crime. The spectacle of dragging a local officer away in cuffs serves no one. It would only deepen the divide between your community and the institution I represent. A faint murmur of surprise rippled through the closest soldiers, quickly stifled. Colonel Chen's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Instead, the general continued, her tone leaving no room for debate, you will report to the Community Outreach Center in town tomorrow morning. You and Officer Rodriguez. You will spend the next 4 weeks performing whatever duties they assign you. You will paint over graffiti. You will clean public parks. You will assist in organizing neighborhood watch programs. You will perform the most mundane, thankless tasks they have. You will do so in your uniforms. And you will speak to every citizen you meet. You will listen to their concerns. You will learn what service truly looks like when it is stripped of authority and pride. You will learn that respect is earned not by commanding it, but by earning it through humble action. Ben slowly raised his head, his eyes wide with disbelief. It was not the punishment he had expected. It was harder. It was a public, ongoing penance. It was a constant, visible reminder of his failure. It was brilliantly, perfectly designed to teach the very lesson he had failed to learn. This is not a vacation, the general stated, her voice hardening slightly. It is a reassignment. A recalibration. You will submit a weekly report to my office, detailing what you have learned. If I sense for one moment that you are treating this as a joke, the full weight of military justice will fall upon you. Do you understand the terms of this debt? Ben could only nod, unable to find his voice. The relief was so potent it was almost as dizzying as the fear had been. It was a second chance, however difficult and humbling. General Sharma gave a single, short nod. Then this matter is concluded. She turned to Colonel Chin. "Colonel, reform the column. We have an exercise to conduct." With that, she turned and walked calmly toward the command vehicle, not looking back. The spell was broken. Colonel Chin snapped back into motion, barking orders. The soldiers, with a last lingering look of contempt and curiosity at the two police officers, began moving with practiced efficiency back to their vehicles. The engines roared back to life, the tanks began to turn, and the immense encircling force started to pull back, retreating back over the hills from whence it came, leaving behind nothing but swirling dust, the faint smell of diesel, and two profoundly changed people standing by a lonely tree on a deserted road. Ben Carter looked at his partner, his face etched with a new, sober understanding. The humiliation was over. The learning was just beginning. He had been given a path to rebuild, not his pride but his character. And he knew with absolute certainty that he would never again judge a book by its cover. If you found this story of humility and redemption compelling, if you were captivated by the journey of a lesson learned the hard way, then consider subscribing for more narratives that explore the profound consequences of our actions and the power of a sincere apology. Your subscription helps bring more thought-provoking tales to life. Thank you for listening.